The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, thank you all for joining us today for the second of a three-part series on ramping up rapid rehousing. Today we are going to hear from the wonderful Kathy Robertson with the Department of Housing and Community Development in Richmond, Virginia. I want to take care of some logistics first. You're all on mute, so you can't join in on the conversation, but there is a little box on your right-hand side where you could submit questions, and we'll look at those questions towards the end and pose them to Kathy. The other thing, amongst the frequently asked questions that we get when we're doing webinars, yes, the slides will be available after the webinar. We'll be posting them on our website, and a recording of the webinar will also be posted up on our website in case anybody's missed that. And we'll make our best efforts to get to every question, but I'm afraid I can't guarantee that. So I want to just cover some really some basics, my perspective as you were, and this is Sharon McDonald from the National Alliance on Homelessness. Sorry for not introducing myself first. So first, what is rapid rehousing? And I said this last month, and I kind of want to say it again. Rapid rehousing sometimes is getting used very loosely in communities, and sometimes it's used as, you're providing just a little bit of financial assistance and no other help. That's not rapid rehousing. Really, rapid rehousing means that you're providing three core pieces of assistance, and that doesn't mean that every single person that you assist requires all these assistance, but that you have these resources available both in your own program or through partnerships. So that includes helping with housing identification, and that means, not sending the client to go look for housing on their own and cut a check when they're available. Perhaps that's the preference for some. But in most situations, it requires really some targeted assistance by the rapid rehousing provider to get to know the landlords, to get to know the housing market, to kind of find out where opportunities are, what the challenges are, and negotiate those relationships. It means providing rent and move-in assistance, some financial support, sized appropriately so that the individual or family can succeed in housing. And it requires follow-up case management and services. That's probably one of the most predominant misconceptions about rapid rehousing. It's housing and leaving. It's not housing and leaving. It's providing the additional supports that people require to be stable in their housing. You're not going to be in the lives of the individuals and families forever. Your goal is to help them stabilize in the housing, but as far as other goals, long-term goals, career aspirations, some of those are best met through partnerships, and you can be part of solving those issues. So rapid rehousing is all of these three things, and please help us spread the word that it's these three things. This webinar today is part of a series that we've been doing. So the first three that we did, starting in December, focused on the core components of rapid rehousing. So we had one dedicated webinar just looking at housing identification strategies, one dedicated webinar on financial assistance and rapid rehousing. Last month, we heard from two great presenters talking about Los Angeles and Mercer County, which is Trenton, New Jersey, and their efforts to ramp up rapid rehousing. Next month, we're going to hear from Houston, Texas, also including Harris County, Texas, and a programmatic intervention that's trying to make a big difference in San Francisco, the Hamilton Family Center. So I urge you to register for that. I think that's going to be great. But we are delighted to hear from Kathy today. Once we finish the Ramping Up Rapid Rehousing series, I think what we're going to do is really look at targeted populations and partnerships. Your recommendations of webinars that would be helpful to you is appreciated. I think we'll probably look at rapid rehousing with single adults, rapid rehousing with survivors of domestic violence, and some other kind of innovations, perhaps rapid rehousing with young moms and partnerships with the early childhood development system in order to support all of the family members. Okay, so I kind of wanted to talk a little bit to kick Kathy off about why it's important to it's important to ramp up your rapid rehousing. And I actually kind of want to give you some old data, and this is what we learned under HPRP, and I think this is important. I know that we've had further confirmation and further data, but when we had lots of money, we saw some good things happen. So we saw reductions in family homelessness and in individual homelessness, but in family homelessness is where I focus. So, for example, during the time of HPRP, we saw that Las Vegas had a decrease in family homelessness by 12%. Mercer County had a decrease in family homelessness by 1/3 in 2 years. We saw that it helped people move out of homelessness for good. We've seen some further evidence of that now, but during the time of of the HPRP, when more communities were doing rapid rehousing, we saw, for example, over 1,000 people in families receiving rapid rehousing in Harris County, Houston, Texas. At the date of this analysis, only 6% of those returned to homelessness. In the state of Michigan, they rehoused nearly 5,000 persons and families, and fewer than 5% returned to homelessness during that time of analysis. That may have increased over time. We didn't follow these folks for long, but it showed that people were moving quickly out of homelessness or permanently out of homelessness. It also helps people move out of homelessness quickly, and that reduces length of time that people are subject to living in shelters. Palm Beach County, Florida, was able to help 69% of the families they rapidly rehouse, exit homelessness within 30 days of entering shelter. They really minimized their shelter exposure. A small rapid rehousing pilot in Richmond, Virginia, contributed to system-wide improvements. Within 2 years, the median length of time families stayed homeless declined by 50%, from 90 days to 45 days. And finally, it makes shelter systems function better. Washington County, Oregon was a place that we looked at that significantly reduced their wait list for shelter through the use of rapid rehousing, and that attracted new general revenue funds from their community. And multiple communities demonstrated that rapid rehousing was a fraction of the cost of other approaches, particularly transitional housing, allowing communities to serve more people with the same amount of resources. Unfortunately, that after HPRP and without dedicated money for rapid rehousing, sorry for that typo there, many communities scaled down their rapid rehousing interventions, returning to the status quo or retaining only small boutique rapid rehousing programs. Bold progress is really going to require us to take bold action. Rapid rehousing cannot be a boutique part of your response. Instead, it really needs to be a much bigger part of your homeless service system. So this is my final slide. We really are urging folks to rethink how they're using homelessness resources, to shift how those funds are used, invest more in rapid rehousing so that it's a system response and not just at the program, but it's provided to more and more people. And it's requiring a lot of coordination and braiding of resources so that you're able to serve as many people as you possibly can. Really ramping up rapid rehousing actually in an environment in which we do not have a lot of resources, new resources for rapid rehousing, means that we're going to have to do tough things. And that means that we're going to have to look at what we're not going to fund anymore. And that means we really need to think about why we're doing homelessness services in the first place and who our primary responsibility is towards. So it's a tough discussion, but it needs to happen. And rapid rehousing needs to be the primary or a primary response to the vast majority of people who are not chronically homeless. Finally, a tip for success from one of my colleagues who wants me to remind everyone that rapid rehousing needs to be rapid. It's not rapid rehousing if you're letting people sit in shelter for 90 days, 120 days, 160 days. We really need to, the purpose of it, a major function of it, a major goal is to help people get back out of homelessness as quickly as possible. It makes those reductions in homelessness occur. It reduces the length of stay. It, I think, improves outcomes for folks. But it's not really doing any of those things if folks are just sitting in shelter for a very long time and then they're getting rapid rehousing. It's sort of not the point at all. So with that, those are just some thoughts that we had that we wanted to share here at the Alliance. So I am now going to turn it over to the wonderful Kathy Robertson.
Thanks, Sharon. Well, good afternoon, everyone. To talk about, next slide, please. To talk about rapid rehousing and taking it to scale in Virginia really requires a little bit of background on the transformation of our homeless services system over recent years. Virginia, the transformation really started in earnest in 2010 when then Governor Bob McDonnell issued Executive Order Number 10 calling for a housing policy framework with a focus on homelessness. This is important because it was the first time that homelessness had garnered that level of attention, that level of state attention. So it was really, the political will was very important in helping us move the system. Our current governor was one of the first governors to sign on to the Veterans Mayor Challenge, so I say that because to just say that he is all into the cause as well. So that the political will is very helpful. Going back to 2010, as a result of that executive order, Virginia developed a plan with 5 major strategies to address homelessness. Moving to rapid rehousing was one of those strategies. Actually, the way that it read was making funding more flexible to engage in best practice models like rapid rehousing. Next slide, please. So in order to really move from a shelter-based system to a system that incorporated best practice models like rapid rehousing, we had to change both the resources and the practices. Something else that I want to point out about the state plan was that what we were charged with was coming up with a plan that was cost neutral. So there was no new funding in this plan, which is why we had to change both the practice and the resources. Next slide, please. This went on simultaneously, changing the resources and the practices, but first I'm going to talk a little bit about how we changed the resources. We started very gradually with a very, very small pilot program, only 4 providers. It was $350,000 primarily. These providers, it was not truly rapid rehousing. It was more like transition in place, but it was not just shelter-based. So it was a move in that direction. That following year, we moved $1 million of what had been traditionally just shelter funding. We redirected it from shelter funding to rapid rehousing activity. And through a competitive application, we awarded 21 projects. And again, that was about $1 million. Then the following year, through the full competitive application process, we moved approximately $4.5 million in state funds to rapid rehousing, and that was of a total of about $7.1 million. And so in those 3 years, we moved from having 4 providers and $350,000 for rapid rehousing to $4.5 million and over 60 grantees providing rapid rehousing. Obviously, there were large variances in the capacity of the grantees and the extent to which the, as Sharon pointed out earlier, the rapid rehousing was actually rapid, but nonetheless, the movement was underway that we were trying to work on this best practice model. Next slide, please. At the same time that we were shifting the funding, we were and changing the resources, we were changing the practices as well by providing training focused on rapid rehousing and capacity building. I like to always say that the stars were aligned. There was the HEARTH Act at the federal level that was really making this move, this shift. There was political will at the state level, and then Virginia was fortunate enough to catch the eye of the Freddie Mac Foundation, which is in Fairfax, Virginia, and they became aware of the state's plan, and as a result, they granted the National Alliance $1 million a year for 3 years for an initiative called the Reducing Family Homelessness in Virginia, a rapid rehousing approach. And that was a collaborative effort between the National Alliance, the Virginia Coalition to End Homelessness, and the Commonwealth of Virginia. It was really important that we bring grantees along as we didn't, as a state, we didn't just want to shift the funding. We didn't just want to, pull the rug out from under providers and say, you now have to do this. We really wanted people to learn about rapid rehousing along the way, to embrace the model, and so we knew that that was the only way that we were going to be successful if we did that. So during the initiative, there were many activities that went along with training organizations and communities about rapid rehousing. First of all, we did rapid rehousing, like just the fundamentals of rapid rehousing to really, again, this was, it was attended by, we had over 300 organizations across the state attend these trainings, and it was really introducing rapid rehousing, really working on what you need to do to change your program to embrace rapid rehousing. There were also learning collaboratives, which were community-focused, and community-focused collaboratives that where really we dove into the specifics of what needs to happen to change the way you're doing business in order to do rapid rehousing, looking at policies, procedures, job descriptions, all of that sort of thing. Back to the old slide, the former slide, sorry. And so there were learning collaboratives as a part of the learning collaboratives, and there were 7 across the state. As a part of those, there was a 100-day challenge in which 32 providers were charged with housing as many families as they could in 100 days, and we ended up housing 545 families in that 100-day period. There were also other tools that we used in order to, or that we presented in order to, for organizations and communities to really look at what they were doing. For example, the spending plan that would help use data to ensure resources were being used more effectively. We also, the Alliance also conducted system design clinics to talk about coordinated assessment and really working as a community. And then there were other data tools as well that are actually still in development. But the bottom line is that from FY12, in FY12, Virginia rapidly rehoused 399 families. In FY14, we rapidly rehoused 2,279 families. So a huge growth there. Next slide, please. But we also knew that if we were really to look at homelessness, look at the big picture, because we knew that there was still duplication of services in some area. There are multiple organizations in communities serving the same populations with rapid rehousing. Perhaps that's not the most effective way. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the bottom line is that we needed to look at the systematic changes and look at how services were being provided on a community level to ensure that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring, to really look at the at homeless services as an emergency response system to homelessness. Next slide, please. So we moved from, in just a few years, we moved from really focusing on shelters to focusing on prevention and rapid rehousing, from focusing on outputs to focusing on outcomes, and focusing on from funding projects and organizations to funding community-based solutions. So we moved to a COC-based application in this last year. Next slide, please. And the reason we did that, there are multiple reasons that we did that, but one of the main reasons is that communities know far better than we do at the state level, what's actually needed in the community. But we also wanted to make sure that organizations and communities were using resources as effectively and as efficiently as possible. The resources are not growing, and while we have actually gotten a little bit more in state funding, overall the resources are not growing a huge amount. So, and there were also other reasons to move to a system-level application, and that was that, there are more requirements on the state and federal level for local and statewide coordination through assessment systems and planning and data and outcomes. Next slide, please, Jim. So we combined our state and federal funding streams into one program, the Virginia Homeless Solutions Program, and that includes the state funding we have for homeless services as well as ESG. And the lead agencies for COCs and the local planning groups of the balance of state are the eligible applicants. The community has to propose the grantees. So the community puts forth the grantees and says what organization is going to provide which of the eligible activities. That includes shelter ops, rapid rehousing, prevention. We allow coordinated assessment, COC planning, HMIS, and admin. HOCWA is a part of that big picture application, but is contracted separately. We also encourage that fiscal agents, that organizations act as fiscal agents to ensure the financial capacity to administer rapid rehousing. What we found over the course of time is that there are organizations out there that, are really want to provide rapid rehousing services but may not have the physical capacity to do so. So again, looking at things on the community level to ensure that those systems are in place. And then working with grantees and COCs regarding policies and procedures, removing barriers. That has been probably one of, I think, the hardest lessons for organizations and communities to learn over the years. That, there were so many barriers to service about like who could be in housing. You could only access rapid rehousing if you had a job, if you had to have a job to be in a transitional housing program. So really working with communities to ensure that those barriers are being removed. And we moved to a 2-year grant process. Next slide, please. So the other purpose in really moving to a COC-based application is to ensure that the system for the community is right-sized and that decisions are data-driven and that people are being diverted from the system when possible. But one of the things that we are looking at in making these awards is, are COCs implementing the core components of rapid rehousing that Sharon described? Is there housing identification? Is there a housing locator in place? Are they providing rent and move-in assistance? And is case management taking place to follow up and ensure housing stabilization? And so, again, looking at all of these things, though, on the system level to make sure that rapid rehousing is eligible for all populations of people experiencing homelessness, not just families, but for all populations, and that those systems are in place. And, do the solutions and the programs address the need? I'll give you a perfect example. There were communities in the state where there were several shelters, family shelters, that were, not full, and yet there were, chronically homeless people living in encampments. So ensuring that the programs out there really address the needs in the community and ensuring that services are no longer duplicated. So moving to the next slide. So just to give you just the results of really what has taken place since 2010 is since 2010, total homelessness has decreased 22.6% in Virginia. And next slide, family homelessness has reduced 25% since 2010. We don't have the results of the 2015 count yet, but we're very pleased with the trend thus far, and we hope that it will continue. So that's all I have. Are there questions?
There is absolutely questions, so thank you very much. And Kathy, so for those who are listening in, please use the little box that says questions and type your question in, and I'll read that and pose it to Kathy. But I'm going to take the right of being the moderator here and ask my own. And okay. That is that official, one of the things that you talked about is that you needed to kind of prepare providers in order to, so you changed the contracting, you changed how the money went out, you changed how the resources could be used and should be used. Can you talk, and another part of the activity was preparing the providers to do the work. Could you talk a little bit about at the beginning some of the biggest challenges that providers were facing and experiencing in reorienting their services, the kind of help that they need, and maybe do a little compare and contrast about where they were as far as rapid rehousing initially and where they are today as far as whether it's something they believe in.
Right. Well, I think that, some of the hardest things in the beginning were the fact that, number one, it was change, and that's always difficult. And there was also, the mentality, if you will, that people were not housing ready, that it was better, of course, to prepare them for the world, and all of those things that are extremely well-intentioned but not necessarily effective, and don't garner good results and are very expensive, as we all know, or we've all learned over time. So I think that really making that change and looking at the change in functions of staff as well, like how did the role of a case manager change, and making that case management totally housing focused as opposed to, fixing all of those issues that were going on with people prior to getting them in housing, get them in housing first, make that case management really focused on housing, get people in housing first, then help them wrap those services around them. So, so it was really a whole paradigm shift, and a whole shift that people had to make, not only with themselves, but with their boards. And, it's a different perspective from a fundraising, point of view. So there were lots of changes that had to go on. As far as how people view it now, I think there's just a world of difference. Most communities are certainly believe in rapid rehousing now, and consider it, a go-to solution for housing, particularly with families. And we're working to make that true for other populations as well. There still seems to be some misconception about that.
Okay, great. I think I accidentally lost the slideshow here. So let me just let me pop up your contact so people will have that in case they need that. So I have a series of questions, and a big theme of one set of those questions is about how do we know this really worked? And just as a caveat, just as a reminder to the audience, what Kathy has is the big picture lens. She's looking at the state, and so it's not, she'll be a bit removed from the day-to-day functioning, but what are the big numbers? So, but Kathy, have you, do you have anything, have you tracked outcomes of families? Are there providers that have worked with families that is looking at returns to homelessness? How do you know that some of these folks who've been rehoused are not popping up again a week after the rent assistance has ended? Is that something that you've looked at in Virginia?
Well, it's something that we're trying to look more and more at the state level. Unfortunately, we don't have a state HMIS in Virginia, so it's difficult to look at that regularly on an ongoing basis. Anecdotally, we have some information from communities throughout Virginia. For example, there is a provider in Richmond, St. Joseph's Villa, that has done a great deal of rapid rehousing work. In fact, they had a transitional housing program that they actually closed, and it is strictly a rapid rehousing program now. But their data indicates like a 97% success rate, meaning that people have not returned to homelessness in like 3 years. So there is some data in communities across the state, and we are trying to develop a way to really assess that on a statewide level right now.
Okay, that's great. I think that one thing that I've seen over the years is that there's two ways to assess where people are, right? And that one of them is to follow them over time. And most homeless continuums certainly don't have that kind of research dollars to do that. And so the kind of the quick and dirty way, maybe not the most perfect way, is usually one COC looking at data to see who's having second homeless episodes. So amongst those who have exited with rapid rehousing, how many of those are returning? And those numbers tend to be, from what I've seen, remarkably similar across communities. And on the family side, it's around it's around maybe 10 to 15% that may have a second episode. So, I mean, I can't promise that they're not becoming homeless in Monroe County, but given the state of the data that we have, it seems very, very promising, and often seems much fewer people returning to homelessness from what I've seen than other intervention models. So you're less likely to come back to homelessness if you've received rapid rehousing in order to enter other housing. So I'm sorry, please.
What I was going to say is, what I can tell you is that prior to moving to rapid rehousing, that just on quarterly reports submitted by providers in Virginia statewide for those organizations that were funded, transitional housing programs, fewer than 50%, and I know this is low, probably lower than the national average, but that fewer than 50% of people were exiting transitional housing to permanent housing. So that in and of itself was alarming. That was before we started any of this.
Okay, great. So another question we have is around diversion. Is this a big part of your picture on the family homelessness front, on the individual front, and is there anything that you can tell me about how that's being implemented in some of these communities? How is that part of the pie?
Well, we have funding for specific to prevention. That is state funding. We have approximately $4 million, and in that we really are trying to get communities to focus on diversion so that people don't enter the system, period. And that is true for single families, anyone, that should be the first line of attack, and that we should be looking at those people, who are getting ready to enter shelter, and can we divert them? Can there be mediation with their family or whoever they're living with? Can we divert them? As from the state perspective, we fund staff for that. We don't fund a lot of other activities such as, paying car bills or paying those sorts of things, but we will fund staff for those efforts.
Okay. So we have had a number of questions actually about housing, and I want to remind people we have actually a dedicated webinar, so it's an hour and a half of people talking about housing strategies in communities like Los Angeles with high vacancy rates and high costs. So I urge people to look at that. That's on our website. But Kathy, big picture, what have you seen as being helpful in getting landlords to work, again, big picture, but getting landlords interested in this model? What challenges have people faced, and how have they overcome that to the extent of what you can tell from your bird's eye view?
Well, just talking with communities about how they're handling those issues. Obviously, at the state we don't deal directly with that, but it is all about relationship building. It's all about working with the landlords to tell them that, or to let them know that you're there, the provider is there if something happens, and that, even though, and maybe setting up an emergency damage fund or something like that. Typically, communities often do that, but rarely, or, in most cases, they don't have to access it at all. But just working, it's relationships, working with the landlord so that the landlord understands that if something goes wrong, they have someone to turn to. I think that has probably been the most successful thing for providers in communities.
So you're working with a number of communities that are implementing rapid rehousing. Is there a standard way of doing it? Is everybody doing rent assistance the same way? If so, what does that look like? Is there an average amount of rent assistance that is provided, or does that vary across communities?
It varies. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, and that's pretty much what I was going to say.
Yeah, no, it varies greatly across communities. What we encourage is that organizations use and communities use progressive engagement and supply as little as possible to get the family stabilized. That said, it doesn't mean that you give up on the stabilization services. They may continue long after the actual financial assistance does, and probably in most cases should. But it varies. It is all over the place. It's all over the place across the state, and it's all over the place within communities. And I would say an average is probably 3 to 4 months, but it varies a great deal.
Okay. And I have a couple of questions around funding. So what are the funding streams that you're using, if any interesting new ones that people should be looking at, for diversion and for some of the case management and the supportive services post-housing after families have been placed or individuals have been placed?
Well, the funding streams that we've combined are, there is ESG, of course, and then we do not use that for prevention, just because there are more federal requirements than we really wanted to implement on the state level. The state money is slightly more flexible than the federal money, but we combined ESG, and then we have state funding that is flexible and is for homeless services. So that is what we use to fund the other activities, such as the COC planning and the coordinated assessment. We wanted to support those activities because we think they're important. We also use that for HMIS and admin. We, of course, we use shelter operations out of both state money and federal funds. And then there is funding that is prevention, that is state funding. All of that is applied for, all of that is handled actually, the way the money is allocated and that sort of thing is all handled on the back end from our organization, DHCD. Communities apply for the one funding source, the Virginia Homeless Solutions Program, and they apply for specific activities. And then we handle where it comes from so that we are, in compliance.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
I think so, and people let me know if it doesn't. You mentioned, with families, and you want to do more on the with individual side. So somebody has a question. It might be your opinion, but what do you think about setting up two different coordinated entries? Should there be one system for individuals and families, or separate systems? Do you have an opinion on that?
Actually, in Virginia, I don't know that I have a personal opinion about it. We have, we have communities in Virginia that are doing it both ways, and both are having success with it. So I think it really boils down to how your community is prepared to handle it, and how your community, how your community responds to it. But I have seen it work in both ways.
Okay. So I'm just rapid-firing questions at you. Here's one. Can you talk a little bit about the % of your emergency solutions grant that is now going towards rapid rehousing versus shelter operations? And I'm going to combine this with another question. Has your investment in rapid rehousing had any negative repercussions in access to shelter for people because you've diverted money there? Okay, I'll answer the first part first, and that was how much is going to what activity. And currently, out of our total funding for the Virginia Homeless Solutions Program, about 18% goes to shelter operations, about 42% to rapid rehousing, about 27% to prevention, about 19%, no, excuse me, 1.9%, about 2% to coordinated assessment, about a little over 3% to COC planning, about 2.5% to HMIS, and about 2% to admin. So the bulk, obviously, the 42% is the largest percentage there, and that is rapid rehousing. Has it had negative repercussions to the operation of shelter? My personal opinion is that we, as a state, encourage communities, especially since we've gone to the community funding, to ensure that there is the safety net of shelters in place in communities, because shelters need to be in place for that triage of getting people into rapid rehousing. There have been some shelters that have closed since, I would not be telling the truth if I didn't say that there have been some shelters that have closed since we have introduced more rapid rehousing, and since we have moved more to rapid rehousing. But there were also some shelters that were not full a lot of the time. So, to say that rapid rehousing, was the demise of the shelters, I don't think that that's fair, and those have been few and far between. But, I think it boils down to dollars being used as effectively and efficiently as possible. We encourage communities to keep that safety net of shelters in their community. I think that's a great answer. I think that if I could sort of jump in, I think that, it just speaks to the fact that you need to think about rapid rehousing as part of your entire system, and you want to retain some of your crisis response so that, when people are facing emergencies, they have a place to go. But often what I've seen, or what I believe and what I understand, is that in a lot of communities, people don't have access to a crisis response because that shelter is full. And by introducing rapid rehousing and introducing a kind of an avenue out of shelter, you actually make the likelihood of that shelter system that is there capable of responding to people in crisis, because there's going to be an opening. But it is very important, I think, to see it all as kind of a interlocking parts, the crisis response and the rapid rehousing, and the importance of it as allowing some flow into the system. I don't know what you think about that.
Sharon, if I may add one thing to that, and that is that some of the shelters that in years past were funded that are no longer funded, that in part is because of barriers that were in place in those shelters, and we won't fund those shelters that have those barriers in place. We will work with shelters to remove those barriers, but we will not fund shelters that have egregious barriers in place.
Could you, just so people understand that, could you describe, and I can understand it, could you describe what you would have considered egregious barriers that shouldn't be in place in shelters?
For example, that they have to be breathalyzed before they come in, that they have to leave every day to get back out on the street and then come back in every night, those sorts of barriers.
Okay. So I have a question. You mentioned early in your presentation that people were provided tools for grantees converting to and providing rapid rehousing. Could you say a little bit more about the tools that you found the most interesting and where people are most helpful and where people might be able to find that? Some of them might be ours, so it's not a plug.
Yeah, you're talking about the data tools?
Yeah, or just the tools that you provided used for communities planning to convert to or move towards rapid rehousing.
Well, the tools, a lot of those things were, the fundamentals of rapid rehousing and that sort of thing. One of the data tools that has been very helpful in helping communities, in fact, when we first put this in an application, there were organizations that were communities who called and said, Kathy, we hated you when we first saw this, but it turned out really well, and we're glad we went through the process. And that was the spending plan, which is on the Alliance website. And that is a data tool by which organizations and communities enter information about funding in the community and services, and how much emergency shelter is there, how much rapid rehousing, how much transitional housing, all of that sort of thing, to really assess where their money's going and to look at it now and then look at it 5 years in the future, and then again, assess where it is and where you want to go. I think communities have found that very helpful. There are 2 other data tools out there that the Alliance worked with Focused Strategies out of Sacramento to develop. Focused Strategies developed them, and they are the base year calculator, the BIC, and the systems performance predictor. And that is a more in-depth look at, for example, how you get from where you are now to your goals. Say, for example, if you want to end veteran homelessness by the end of 2015, what do you need to do? How do you need to move the money? How do you need to change the services in order to get there? And so that's a much more in-depth tool, and I would recommend that if people are interested in that they Sharon, I don't know if that's on y'all's website now, but they can certainly contact Focus Strategies as well.
Okay, great. So I have a question, just again, you're sort of a bird's eye view, so there's multiple programs receiving rapid rehousing that you're involved in funding and overseeing and contracting with. But in general, how do families or how do individuals access rapid rehousing? Do they have to be in shelter in order to get rapid rehousing services? How do they enter the process in general?
Actually, this varies across the state. In most cases, I think that people actually enter shelter first, but not in all cases. In some cases, I mentioned that, for example, the organization St. Joseph's Village closed their transitional housing and now just does rapid rehousing. They do that actually in 2 different communities in Virginia, and that, people are rapidly rehoused, essentially immediately upon entering the system. But I think in most cases, people are in shelter for a period of time before accessing rapid rehousing services.
Okay, and I think that, well, I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this, but I might make this the last question. Have you seen an increase in homelessness among college students?
Well, I don't really know the answer to that, quite frankly. I mean, there is, now in the point-in-time count, we count, or you can look at those age groups as far as whether they are college students or not. That the point-in-time count doesn't give us that information on, in the bigger picture level. Now, part of our coordinating council, which is our governor's coordinating council on homelessness, which is essentially Virginia's interagency council, as a committee of that, we have the interagency partnership to prevent and end youth homelessness. And of course, there is the federal goal of ending family and youth homelessness by 2020. So we are exploring a lot of things around college students, around that age range from, 18 to 24, and what's going on and how to address that and what are the appropriate housing solutions. So we're working on that, but I don't really know. I can't answer that question, actually.
Okay, yeah, and I think that just to add to that, I think, we are working our best to, and we need communities to work on this also, to improve the data about homeless youth. So homelessness among those 18 to 24 and homelessness among unaccompanied youth under the age of 18. And so as you're thinking about your point-in-time count, you need different strategies to find these young people, and we need to think about adding in some significant or some different kinds of questions. I think our data, on the youth side in every form is not perfect. So all we can do is make it the best that we can so that we get a better understanding of that. And I just kind of want to go back because I had, to your other question, to the response to the other question about who gets rapid rehousing. And I think that one thing that's just important to have a caveat about is that, one of the purposes or one of the values of rapid rehousing is to help, people move out of homelessness, out of shelter, out of literal homelessness more rapidly, and a lot of the resources that HUD provides is targeted to that that subpopulation, people who are literally in shelter, not necessarily been in transitional housing for 2 years. That's not the target population. The purpose of transitional housing is supposed to, help you reconnect to permanent housing absent another intervention. I think some of the tools that we've created around rapid rehousing, that housing search, that housing placement, that short-term rent assistance, some of those housing stabilization can be used for other populations. For example, maybe some families who are living in motels and never entered the formal homeless service system. They may be paying rent on their own. We can use what we've learned for other populations, and we may need to explore other funding streams in order to apply those skills. So, so I hope I didn't muddy the water up there, but I just want to sort of clarify that typically when we're talking about rapid rehousing with the HUD resources, we're talking about people living in shelter or outdoors. Okay, Kathy, any last thoughts?
No.
Any words of wisdom for people who want to start ramping up stuff in their own community?
Well, just that it's you know, that it's well worth it. That it isn't necessarily easy. I mean, I think that communities have to work together. I think that communities have to have those tough conversations of who's going to do what and how they're going to work together to ensure that the homeless services system is a crisis, an emergency crisis response system, and that you know, homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. So, but it takes a collaborative effort to make that happen.
Great. And I think the bottom line for everybody, one of the biggest reasons to do it is the 25% reduction in family homelessness, the 20% reduction in individuals, homelessness among individuals, and the sense that nobody wants to be homeless. Nobody wants to be in shelter. People want to be in their own homes, and this is a tool for us to be able to do that. And so so it's not an easy process. It's a challenging process, as you say, but it's a worthwhile process, I think. So thank you very, very much, Kathy, for sharing your wisdom. And thank you all for listening. And so the slides will be available on our website. The recording will be available on our website. And next year we're going to be hearing from folks